Athens has voted to kill every grown man in Mytilene and sell the rest into slavery. That was yesterday. This morning Athens changed its mind. So a second ship is rowing east through the night, a full day behind the first, the crew eating at the oar, trying to overtake an execution order. The Mytilenean ambassadors paid for the provisions themselves, wine and barley cakes kneaded with oil. The crew sleep in shifts, so the oars never stop, and they catch it. Thucydides notes that the first ship had been in no hurry, sailing on so horrid an errand, and that the Athenian commander Patches had just finished reading the decree aloud when the second came into the harbor. So near, he writes, did Mytilene come to disaster. 11 years later, the same city does the same thing to a different island. In this time, there is no debate to record, no decree that survives, and no second ship, because there is nothing to overtake. Nothing in Athenian law changed in between. No tyrant took power. No constitution was suspended. What happened in the middle is the story, and it is stranger than you think, because the machine never broke. It kept working perfectly the entire time. Start in 431. Pericles tells the Athenians to treat their own city as an island. Abandon Attica. Let the Spartans burn it. Live behind the walls, off the fleet and the tribute. The numbers: 600 talents a year from the allies, 6,000 talents of silver on the Acropolis, 300 seaworthy triremes. On paper, it is unanswerable. And every one of those numbers reaches us from one man who says in his own preface that he wrote the speeches himself to fit the occasion. Remember that. It matters most later, in a room he was not in. So the countryside came in, unwillingly, and camped in the empty lots, in the temples, in the towers of the wall, and on ground an oracle had said to leave desolate. In the summer of 430, the disease came in through the port. Thucydides refuses to say what caused it. He sets down only the symptoms, so a future reader might recognize the thing if it returned. He had it himself. Nobody since has recognized it. The physicians died fastest because they visited the sick most often, and the burial rites were overturned. A man would carry his own dead to a stranger's pyre, light it, and walk away. Then he makes an argument, and hear it as an argument. The plague, he says, introduced a general lawlessness. Men stopped fearing the gods because worship made no difference, and stopped fearing the law because nobody expected to live long enough to stand trial. He puts this immediately after the funeral oration, the most idealized portrait of a city in Greek literature. The order is chronological. The oration is winter, the plague the following summer. The choice is how much room he gives each, and that he lets the second answer the first. And the argument mostly fails the test. The courts kept sitting. The tribute kept arriving. The assembly kept meeting. That is the problem. If the plague didn't break the rules, and it didn't, then what Athens does later was not done by a broken city. It was done by a working one, which means whatever changed isn't in the law. It's in the room. Now, the room that voted to kill Mytilene. It met on the Pnyx, a hillside holding perhaps 6,000 men out of a citizen body of 40 to 60,000. One man in 8, and nobody was paid to be there. A handful of rules ran it, and almost every one was built to stop a single man from staying too long. It ran on the lot, 500 counselors, 50 from each tribe, 1 year, 2 terms in a lifetime. And one of them, drawn by lot that morning, held the keys to the treasuries and the public records and the seal of Athens for one night and never again. Almost every office worked like that. The exceptions were the offices that commanded armed men. Those were elected and could be held again without limit. That is where Pericles had lived for 15 years, until he was deposed and fined and re-elected and died in the autumn of 429. Then the plague changed who stood on that hillside, and the lazy version, that the crowd got stupid, is false. The evacuation had put tens of thousands of country citizens a 10-minute walk from a Pnyx. They had always lived too far out to reach. That assembly was arguably more representative than the one before it. And the countable dead were countable only because they were on the rolls. Thucydides gives two figures, no fewer than 4,400 hoplites and 300 cavalry. Of the rest of the multitude, P says, the number was never ascertained. What Athens lost was not intelligence and not a class. It was years, men of every rank who had sat through the same argument before, in a system with nowhere to keep what they knew. The Areopagus, the one lifetime council, had lost its guardianship of the Constitution in 462. The council turned over every year. The chairman changed every 24 hours. Records existed, but nowhere were they kept together. There was no one place to look something up. The restraints, in other words, were never written down. They lived in people. Hold on to that. In about 2 minutes, it decides whether a city lives. In 428, Mytilene revolted. Lesbos was not a tribute-paying subject, but one of the last autonomous allies, supplying its own ships. Methymna, the other city on the island, stayed with Athens. When the food ran out, the Spartan officer inside Mytilene armed the common people for a breakout. The instant they had weapons, they refused orders and demanded the rich bring out the hidden grain. The oligarchs surrendered within hours. The assembly met. Thucydides says only that in their anger, they decreed death for every adult male and slavery for the women and children. A ship left the same day, and the next morning, he writes, repentance came. Note the mechanism. The reversal was lobbied. The Mytilenean envoys worked on their Athenian friends and on the magistrates to reopen the question, and the magistrates agreed easily because they could see the crowd wanted an excuse. Cleon spoke first, not poor, and not a working tanner. He owned the workshop, and in 425, he would promise to bring the Spartans back from Spacteria in 20 days, and do it. Your empire, he said, is a tyranny, not the invention of a demagogue. Pericles had said the same, and he named the 3 things most fatal to empire: pity, the pleasure of listening to speeches, and decency. Then a man called Diodotus stood up. He appears in this one episode, and nowhere else, not later in Thucydides, not in any other source. Thucydides notes he had argued the same way at the first assembly, and lost. We have one speech from him, and then nothing. And here's the part everyone softens. Diodotus took 2 of Cleon's 3 words and disowned them. He was not asking anyone to be moved by pity or by decency. The question is not what these people deserve. It is how to make Mytilene useful to Athens. The death penalty deters nobody, because men are driven by hope and by desire. Kill everyone, and every future rebel holds out to the last man. And then the point that won, in every city in the empire, the common people are on your side. At Mytilene, they proved it. The moment they had weapons, they handed you the city. The show of hands, Thucydides says, was almost equal. Nobody counted them. Diodotus carried it, and the second ship went out. And then Athens executed the prisoners anyway. The manuscripts say a little more than 1,000 men, a figure many editors think is a copyist's error for something far smaller. Whatever the number, they died on Cleon's motion, and Diodotus had moved that they be tried at leisure. They were not tried at all. The walls came down, the fleet was confiscated, and the land was cut into 3,000 allotments, 300 for the gods, their rent to the treasury, and 2,700 handed to individual Athenians, who collected the rent themselves. Methymna kept its land, so this is not a story about mercy. The machine could still stop itself, barely. And what stopped it was not conscience, but one man arguing that restraint was profitable, in a room where enough people still knew why that case had ever been made. Which rules out the easy explanation. The plague is not the cause. 427 is after both waves, the 4,400 already off the rolls, and Diodotus won in front of exactly the citizen body that is supposed to have lost its judgment. What Athens lacked was not virtue. It was anywhere to file an argument. 11 years later, Melos. Melos was no innocent bystander. Athens raided it in 426 and assessed it for 15 talents, which it never paid. In the summer of 416, 38 ships and roughly 2,700 hoplites arrived under two generals, Cleomedes and Tisias, while Athens was formally at peace with Sparta. The Melian magistrates would not let the Athenian envoys speak to their assembly and kept them to the few. The Athenians said they knew exactly why. The common people might have been persuaded. The one argument that had saved Mytilene was locked out of the room by the Melians themselves. Then comes the most famous passage in Greek historiography, and here that preface comes back. It is the only extended dialogue in the whole history. Everywhere else, set-piece oratory, and the only negotiation he stages with no named person speaking on either side. It happened behind closed doors, and he had been in exile since 424 and cannot have had a witness. So when you hear that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, you are hearing Thucydides compressing a position. His Athenians tell the Melians that hope is danger's comforter, affordable only to those with resources to spare, which is Diodotus' analysis of hope doing opposite work. In 427, it argued for restraint. Here it argues that resistance is a luxury the weak cannot afford. The echo is Thucydides. One author hands the same tool to a man saving a city and to men taking one apart, and that is his point about the tool. The Melians would not in one moment give up a city that had stood 700 years. The Athenians built a wall around them. That winter there was treachery inside, and Melos surrendered at discretion. Noun, Thucydides gives it one sentence. The Athenians put to death all the grown men they took, sold the women and children, and later sent out 500 colonists. That is the real contrast, and it is sharper than the tidy one. Not two debates, one merciful and one monstrous. One recorded debate, and then a killing with no recorded debate at all. No decree, no speech, no second ship because there was nothing to overtake. And Melos was not the first. Athens had voted the same for Chione in 423 and done it in 421. What is missing by 416 is not the capacity. It is the argument against it, which had never been a rule. It was a man, and the man is gone, which leaves one question for the rest of this, with nobody left to talk it out of anything. Does the assembly ever stop itself? They voted for Sicily the next year. Watch what it does with its own power to say no. Envoys arrived from Egesta with 60 talents of silver, having, Thucydides says, paraded the same borrowed dinner service party after party for the Athenian inspectors. The assembly voted 60 ships. 5 days later it met to vote the equipment, and Nicias reopened the whole question, because he wanted no part of it. When arguing failed, he tried to frighten them off by naming a price nobody would pay. A man in the crowd told him to stop making excuses and say what he actually wanted. Nicias said, not fewer than 100 triremes, not fewer than 5,000 hoplites, archers, slingers, corn ships, bakers. Far from having their appetite taken away by the burden of the preparations, Thucydides says, they became more eager than ever. And then the vote, which was not for 100 ships. The assembly voted that the generals should have full powers over the numbers and over the expedition generally. Told the price was enormous. It gave away its own right to fix the size of the force and never fixed it again. It only ever voted more. The few who disliked the plan kept their hands down. Thucydides adds, for fear of looking unpatriotic. 2 years later, Nicias had a letter read out. The besiegers had become the besieged, the ships rotting. Recall the army, or send a second one as large as the first. And relieve me, I am ill. They refused to relieve him, and voted the second army. You know how it ends. An eclipse fell, and Nicias took the soothsayer's advice and waited 27 days, and in those days the Syracusans chained the harbor shut. Few, out of very many, came home. And at Athens, Thucydides writes, they turned in fury on the orators who had urged the expedition and on the prophets, as though they had not voted for it themselves, which brings us to 406. Athens melted the gold off the Acropolis dedications, put medics and slaves at the oars, and manned a fleet in 30 days. off the Arginusae Islands. It won the largest naval battle ever fought between Greeks. Then a storm came up, and the 47 ships sent to pick the men out of the water could not do it. The assembly deposed the generals. 2 never came home. 6 did. At the first hearing, they produced their pilots and their witnesses, and the room was inclining to acquit. And then it grew too dark to see a show of hands, and the meeting adjourned. In the gap fell the Apaturia, the festival where families gather and the missing become visible. Xenophon says Theramina's friends used it. They arranged for a crowd to come to the next assembly in black, heads shaven, as if they were relatives of the drowned. The safeguards were not overwhelmed by grief. Somebody produced grief on schedule, then a counselor named Calixenus brought in the motion. No further defense, 1 vote on all of them together, and the penalty is death. Now, watch the safety catches. Euryptolemus lodged a grave paranomon, the standing action against an illegal proposal which suspends it. The crowd shouted that it was monstrous the people should be prevented from doing whatever it wished. A man named Lyciscus moved that Euryptolemus be judged by the same vote as the generals. The indictment was withdrawn. Then, the 50 presiding counselors declared they would not put an illegal motion, and Calixenus turned the same threat on them, and one by one they gave way. All, except one. Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, said that in no case would he act except in accordance with the law. Euryptolemus then moved that they be tried one at a time, as the law required, and it carried on a show of hands. An objection was sworn. A second show of hands was taken the same afternoon, in the same room, by the same men, and it went the other way. 6 generals were executed. Not long afterward, Xenophon says, repentance seized the Athenians, and they voted charges against the men who had deceived them. In 405, the fleet was beached at Aegospotami, an open shore with no harbor and no market. Alcibiades, in exile nearby, rode down and told them so, and was told they were in command now. When Lysander took the fleet off the beach, the victors voted to execute the prisoners, citing an Athenian decree to cut the right hand off every man taken alive. 1 man was spared, Adamantus, who had spoken against that motion. A show of hands had come back as a charge sheet. The news reached Piraeus at night, and Xenophon says the wailing ran up the long walls into the city, and nobody slept, mourning not only the dead but themselves, thinking of what they had done to the Melians and the Cyaneans and the Aeginetans. Take that as evidence, not as a verdict. No city gets what it deserves, and nothing in the arithmetic of a siege is anybody's justice. It is the only surviving trace of anyone in Athens treating Melos as a decision somebody made. The terms in 404, pull down the long walls, surrender every ship but 12, follow where Sparta leads. The assembly voted yes, and the walls came down to the music of flute girls, the allies in garlands, thinking that day the beginning of freedom. Then it voted 30 men into office to draft the ancestral laws. They never drafted them. Not less than 1,500 Athenians were killed without trial in about 8 months. And when the democracy came back in 403, it built what it had never had: the law code, revised and cut into stone. A rule that a decree of the assembly may not override a law. The city's past self gets a vote. And around the turn of the century, the scattered records were gathered into one building, the Metroon, where a man could look something up. Athens put into stone the memory it had been keeping in a few men's heads. Nobody broke in. Every safety catch in this story was released from the inside. By a vote, the illegality suit withdrawn under threat. The presiding 50 talked into putting a motion they had just called illegal. One collective verdict where the law said one at a time. The forms were kept. The forms were all that were kept. The hands went up. The hands were judged. The motion carried. In 427, it was overtaken by one ship rowing all night, because one man in one room had made an argument once. Nobody wrote the argument down. So the next time, no ship left the harbor. The machine never failed. It only ever did what it was told by whoever was still alive to tell it.